Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing in The Well at the World's End, a tale by William Morris. We are on Volume 1, Chapter 5. This chapter is entitled, Ralph Cometh to Higham on the Way. And with that I will start. Not more befell Ralph to tell of till he came to the end of the downs, and saw Higham lying below him, overlooked by a white castle on a knoll, and with a river lapping it about, and winding on through its fair green meadows, even as Clement had told. From amidst its houses rose up 3 towers of churches above their leaden roofs, and high above all, long and great, the Abbey church. And now was the low sun glittering on its gilded vanes, and the wings of the angels high upon the battlements. So Ralph rode down the slopes, and was brisk about it, for it was drawing toward sunset, and he knew not at what hour they shut their gates. The road was steep and winding, and it was the more part of an hour ere he came to the gate. It was open, and like to be yet, for many folk were thronging in, which throng also had hindered him soon after he came into the plain country. The gate was fair and strong, but Ralph saw no men-at-arms about it that evening. He rode into the street unquestioned, and therein was the throng great of people clad in fair and gay attire. And presently Ralph called to mind that this was St. John's Eve, so that he knew that there was some feast toward. At last the throng was so thick that he was stayed by it, and therewithal a religious who was beside him and thrust up against his horse turned to him and gave him good even, and said, By the weapons and gear thou art a stranger here in our burg, Sir Knight. So it is, said Ralph. And whither away? Said the monk. Hast thou some kinsman or friend in the town? Nay, said Ralph, I seek a good hostelry where I may abide the night for my money. The monk shook his head and said, See ye the folk? It is a holiday time, and midsummer after haysel. Ye shall scarce get lodging outside our house. But what then? Come thou thither straightway, and have harbour of the best, and see our prior, who loveth young and brisk men-at-arms like thee. Lo now, the throng openeth a little. I will walk by the bridle, and lead thee the shortest road thither. Ralph gainsayed him not, and they bored through the throng of the street till they came into the market square, which was very great and clean, paved with stones all over. Tall and fair houses rose up on 3 sides of it, and on the 4th was the great church, which made those houses seem but low. Most of it was new-built, for the Lord Abbot that then was, though he had not begun it, had taken the work up from his forerunner, and had pushed it forward all he might, for he was very rich, and an open-handed man. Like dark gold it showed under the evening sun, and the painted and gilded imagery shone like jewels upon it. Yea, said the monk, as he noted Ralph's wonder at this wonder, a most goodly house it is, and happy shall they be that dwell there. Therewith he led Ralph on, turning aside through the great square. Ralph saw that there were many folk therein, though it was too big to be thronged thick with them. Amidst of it was now a great pile of wood hung about with flowers, and hard by it a stage built up with hangings of rich cloth on one side thereof. He asked the monk what this might mean, and he told him the wood was for the midsummer balefire, and the stage for the show that should come thereafter. So the brother led Ralph down a lane to the south of the great west door, and along the side of the minster, and so came to the abbey gate. And there was Ralph well greeted, and had all things given him which were due to a good knight. And then was he brought into the guest hall, a very fair chamber which was now full of men of all degrees. He was shown to a seat on the dais within 2 of the sub-priors, and beside him sat an honourable lord, a vassal of St. Mary's. So was supper served well and abundantly. The meat and drink was of the best, and the vessel and all the plenishing was as good as might be. And the walls of that chamber were hung with noble arras cloth, picturing the pilgrimage of the soul of man. Every man there who spoke with Ralph, and there were many, was exceeding courteous to him. And he heard much talk about him of the wealth of the lands of St. Mary's at Higham, and how it was flourishing, and of the abbot how mighty he was, so that he might do what he would, and that his will was to help and to give, and be blithe with all men. And folk told of turmoil and war in other lands, and praised the peace of Higham on the way. Ralph listened to all this and smiled, and said to himself that to another man this might be well the end of his journey for that time. But for him all this peace and well-being was not enough. For though it were a richer land than Upmeads, yet to the peace and the quiet he was well used. And he had come forth not to the winning of fatter peace, but to try what new thing his youth and his might and his high hope and his good hap might accomplish. So when the supper was over, and the wine and spices had been brought, the guest hall began to thin somewhat. And the brother who had brought Ralph thither came to him and said, Fair lord, it were nowise ill if ye went forth, as others of our guests have done, to see the deeds of Midsummer Eve, and that shall be done in the great square in honour of Holy John, for our manor therein at Higham has been much thought of. Look, my son. He pointed to the windows of the hall therewith, and lo, they grew yellow and bright with some fire without, as if a new fiery day had been born out of the dusk of the summer night. For the light that shone through the windows outdid the candle light in the hall. Ralph started thereat, and laid his right hand to the place of his sword, which indeed he had left with the chamberlain. But the monk laughed and said, Fear nothing, lord, there is no foeman in Higham. Come now, lest thou be belated of the show. So he led Ralph forth into the square, where there was a space appointed for the brethren and their guests to see the plays. And the square was now so full of folk that it seemed like as if there were no man in the streets, which were erewhile so thronged. There were rows of men-at-arms and bright armour also to keep the folk in their places, like as hurdles pin the sheep up, howbeit they were nowise rough with the folk, but humble and courteous. Many and many were the torches of cressets burning steadily in the calm air, so that, as aforesaid, night was turned into day. But on the scaffold, aforesaid, were standing bright and gay figures, whose names or what they were Ralph had no time to ask. Now the bells began to clash from the great tower of the minster. In a little while they had clashed themselves into order, and rang clear and tunably for a space. And while they were ringing, lo, those gay-clad people departed from the scaffold, and a canvas painted like a mountainside, rocky, with caves therein, was drawn up at the back of it. Then came thereon one clad like a king, holding a fair maiden by the hand, and with him was a dame richly clad, and with a crown on her head. So these two kissed the maiden, and lamented over her, and went their ways. And the maiden, left alone, sat down upon a rock, and covered up her face and wept. And while Ralph wondered what this might mean, or what grieved the maiden, there came creeping, as it were, from out of a cranny of the rocks, a worm, huge-headed and covered over with scales that glittered in the torchlight. Then Ralph sprang up in his place, for he feared for the maiden that the worm would devour her. But the monk who sat by him pulled him down by the skirt and laughed and said, Sit still, lord, for the champion also has been provided. Then Ralph sat down again somewhat abashed, and looked on, yet was his heart in his mouth the while. And so while the maiden stood as one astonished before the worm, who gaped upon her with wide open mouth, there came forth from a cleft in the rocks a goodly knight who bore silver, a red cross. He had his sword in his hand, and he fell in upon the worm to smite him, and the worm ramped up against him, and there was battle betwixt them, while the maiden knelt anigh with her hands clasped together. Then Ralph knew that this was a play of the fight of St. George with the worm. So he sat silent till the champion had smitten off the worm's head, and had come to the maiden, and kissed and embraced her, and shown her the grisly head. Then presently came many folk onto the scaffold, to wit, the king and queen, who were the father and mother of the maiden, and a bishop clad in very fair vestments, and knights withal. And they stood about St. George and the maiden, and with them were minstrels, who fell to playing upon harps and fiddles, while some other fell to singing a sweet song in honor of St. George, and the maiden delivered. So when it was all done, the monk said, This play is set forth by the men-at-arms of our Lord Abbot, who have had great devotion toward St. George, and he is their friend and their good lord. But hereafter will be other plays, of wild men and their feasting in the woods in the golden age of the world, and that is done by the scribes and the limners. And after that will be a pageant of St. Agnes, ordered by the clothiers and webbers, which be both many and deft in this good town. Albeit thou art a young man, and hast ridden far today, belike and mayhappen thou wilt not be able to endure it. So it may be well to bring thee out of this throng straightway. Moreover, I have bethought thee that there is much of what is presently to come, which we shall see better from the minster roof, or even it may be from the tower. Wilt thou come then? Ralph had liefer have sat there and seen all the plays to the end, for they seemed to him exceeding fair, and like to ravish the soul from the body. Howbeit, being shamefaced, he knew not how to gainsay the brother, who took him by the hand, and led him through the press to the west front of the minster, where on the north side was a little door and a nook. So they went up a stair therein a good way till they came into a gallery over the western door. And looking forth thence, Ralph deemed that he could have seen a long way had daylight been, for it was higher than the tops of the highest houses. So there they abode a space, looking down upon the square and its throng, and the bells which had been ringing when they came up now ceased a while. But presently there arose great shouts and clamour amongst the folk below, and they could see men with torches drawing near to the pile of wood, and then all of a sudden shot up from it a great spiring flame, and all the people shouted together, while the bells broke out again over their heads. Then the brother pointed aloof with his finger and said, Lo you, fair lord, how Baal speaks to Baal all along the headlands of the down country, and below there in the thorps by the river. Forsooth Ralph saw fire after fire break out to the westward, and the brother said, And if we stood over the high altar and looked east, ye would see more of such fires, and many more. And all these bales are piled up and lighted by vassals and villains of my lord abbot. Now tonight they are but mere midsummer bale fires. But doubt ye not that if there came war into the land, each one of these bales would mean at least a half a score of stout men, archers and men-at-arms, all ready to serve their lord at all adventure. All this the tyrants round about that hate the holy church and oppress the poor know full well. Therefore we live in peace in these lands. Ralph hearkened, but said naught, for amidst all this flashing of fire and flame, and the crying out of folk, and the measured clash of the bells so near him, his thought was confused, and he had no words ready to hand. But the monk turned from the parapet, and looked him full in the face, and said to him, Thou art a fair young man, and strong, and of gentle blood, as I deem, and thou seemest to me to have the lucky look in thine eyes. Now I tell thee, that if thou wert to take service with my lord, thou shouldest never rue it. Yea, why shouldest thou not wax in his service, and become his captain of captains, which is an office meet for kings? Ralph looked on him, but answered not, for he could not gather his thoughts for an answer. And the brother said, Think of it, I bid thee, fair young lord, and be sure that nowhere shalt thou have a better livelihood, not even wert thou a king's son. For the children of my lord abbot are such that none dareth to do them any displeasure, neither is any overlord as good as his holy church. Yea, said Ralph, doubtless thou sayest sooth, yet I wot not that I come forth to seek a master. Said the brother, Nay, but do see the lord abbot, as thou mayest do tomorrow, if thou wilt. I would have his blessing, said Ralph. No less shalt thou have, said the brother. But look ye down yonder, for I can see tokens that my lord is even now coming forth. Ralph looked down and beheld the folk parting to right and left, and a lane made amidst the throng, guarded by men-at-arms, mingled with the cross-bearers and brethren, and the sound of trumpets blared forth over the noises of the throng. If the lord abbot cometh, said Ralph, I were fain of his blessing tonight before I sleep. So go we down straightway, that I may kneel before him with the rest. What, said the monk, wilt thou, my lord, kneel amongst all these burgesses and vavasors, when thou mightest see the abbot in his own chamber, face to face alone with him? Father, said Ralph, I am no great man, and I must needs depart betimes tomorrow. for I perceive that here are things too mighty and overmastering for such as I be." "Well," said the monk, "yet mayest thou come back again, so at present I will make no more words about it." So they went down and came out amidst the throng, above which the bale still flared high, making the summer night as light as day. The brother made way for Ralph, so that they stood in front of the row of folk. They had not been there 1 minute ere they heard the sound of the brethren singing, and the abbot came forth out of the lane that went down to the gate. Then all folk went down upon their knees, and thus abode him. Right so Ralph deemed that he felt someone pull his sleeve, but in such a throng that was not of a wonder. Howbeit he turned and looked to his left, whence came the tug, and saw kneeling beside him a tall man-at-arms, who bore a sallay on his head, in such wise that it covered all his face, save the point of his chin. Then Ralph bethought him of the man of the leafless tree, and he looked to see what armory the man bore on his coat, but he had nothing save a loose frock of white linen over his hauberk. Nevertheless he heard a voice in his ear which said, "The second time," whereon he deemed that it was verily that same man. Yet had he naught to do to lay hold on him, for he might not speak with him, for even therewith came the abbot in garments all of gold, going afoot under a canopy of baudekyn, with the precious mitre on his head, and the crozier borne before him, as if he had been a patriarch, for he was an exceeding mighty lord. Ralph looked hard on him as he passed by, blessing the folk with upraised hand, and he saw that he was a tall, spare man, clean-shaven and thin-faced, but no old man, belike scarce of 50 winters. Ralph caught his eye, and he smiled on the goodly young man so kindly that for a moment Ralph deemed that he would dwell in St. Mary's house for a little while. For, thought he, if my father or Nicholas hear me therein, they must even let me alone to abide here. Therewith the abbot went forth to his place, and sat him down under a goodly cloth of estate, and folk stood up again. But when Ralph looked for the man in the sallay, he could see naught of him. Now when the abbot was set down, men made a clear ring about the bale. And there came into the said ring 12 young men, each clad in naught save a goatskin, and with garlands of leaves and flowers about their middles. They had with them a wheel done about with straw and hemp, paid with pitch and brimstone. They set fire to the same, and then trundled it blazing round about the bale 12 times. Then came to them 12 damsels, clad in such like guise as the young men. Then both bands, the young men and the maidens, drew near to the bale, which was now burning low, and stood about it, and joined hands and danced round it a while. And meantime the fiddles played an uncouth tune merrily. Then they sundered, and each couple of men and maids leapt backward and forwards over the fire. And when they had all leapt, came forward men with buckets of water, which they cast over the dancers, till it ran down them in streams. Then was all the throng mingled together, and the folk trod the embers of the bale under foot, and scattered them hither and thither all over the square. All this while men were going about with pitchers of wine and ale and other good drinks, and every man drank freely what he would, and there was a greatest game and joyance. But now was Ralph exceeding weary, and he said, "Father, mightest thou lead me out of this throng, and show me some lair where I may sleep in peace? I would thank thee blithely." As he spake, there sounded a great horn over the square, and the abbot rose in his place, and blessed all the people once more. Then said the monk, "Come then, fair field lord, now thou shalt have thy will of bed." And he laughed therewith, and drew Ralph out of the throng, and brought him into the abbey, and into a fair little chamber, on the wall whereof was pictured Saint Christopher and Saint Julian, the lord and friend of wayfarers. Then he brought Ralph the wine and spices, and gave him good night, and went his ways. As Ralph put the raiment from off him, he said to himself, "A long day forsooth, so long that I should have thought no day could have held all that has befallen me. So many strange things have I seen that surely my dreams shall be full of them, for even now I seem to see them, though I waken." So he lay down in his bed and slept, and dreamed that he was fishing with an angle in a deep of Upmead's water, and he caught many fish. But after a while, whatsoever he caught was but of gilded paper stuffed with wool, and at last the water itself was gone, and he was casting his angle onto a dry road. Therewith he awoke, and saw that day was dawning. He heard the minster clock strike 3, and heard the thrushes singing their first song in the prior's garden. Then he turned about and slept, and dreamed no more till he woke up in the bright sunny morning. Chapter 6. Ralph goeth his ways from the Abbey of St. Mary at Higham. It was the monk who had been his guide the day before who had now waked him, and he stood by the bedside holding a great bowl of milk in his hand. And as Ralph sat up and rubbed his eyes, with all his youthful sloth upon him, the monk laughed and said, "That is well, Lord, that is well. I love to see a young man so sleepy in the morning. It is a sign of thriving, and I see thou art thriving heartily for the time when thou shalt come back to us to lead my Lord's host in battle." "Where be the balefires?" said Ralph, not fully awake. "Where be they?" said the brother. "Where be they? They be sunken to cold coals long ago, like many a man's desires and hopes, who hath not yet laid his head on the bosom of the mother, that is the Holy Church. Come, my lord, arise and drink the monk's wine of morning. And then if you must needs ride, ride betimes and ride hard, for the wood perilous beginneth presently as you wend your ways. And it were well for thee to reach the burg of the Four Friths ere thou be benighted. For, son, there be untoward things in the wood, and though some of them be of those whom Christ's cross was shapen, yet have they forgotten hell, and hope not for heaven. And their byword is, Thou shalt lack ere I lack. Furthermore, there are worse wights in the wood than they be, God save us. But against them I have a good hauberk, a neck-guard which I will give thee, son, in token that I look to see thee again at the lovely house of Mary our mother." Ralph had taken the bowl and was drinking, but he looked over the brim and saw how the monk drew from his frock a pair of beads, as like to Dame Catherine's gift, as one pea to another, save that at the end thereof was a little box shapen crosswise. Ralph emptied the bowl hastily, got out of bed, and sat on the bed naked, save that on his neck was Dame Catherine's gift. He reached out his hand and took the beads from the monk, and reddened therewith, as was his wont when he had begun a contest in words. But he said, "I thank thee, father, yet God wot if these beads will lie sweetly alongside the collar which I bear on my neck as now, which is the gift of a dear friend." The monk made up a solemn countenance and said, "Thou sayest sooth, my son. It is most likely that my chaplet, which hath been blessed time was by the holy Richard, is no meet fellow for the gift of some light love of thine. Or even," quoth he, noting Ralph's flush deepen and his brow knit, "or even if it were the gift of a well-willer, yet belike it is a worldly gift. Therefore, since thy journey is with peril, thou wert best to do it off, and let me keep it for thee till thou comest again." Now as he spake, he looked anxiously, nay, it may be said greedily at the young man. But Ralph said naught, for in his heart he was determined not to chaffer away his gossip's gift of any shaveling's token. Yet he knew not how to set his youthful words against the father's wisdom, so he stood up and got his shirt into his hand. And as he did it over his head, he fell to singing to himself a song of eventide of the high house of Upmeads, the words whereof were somewhat like to these: "Art thou man, art thou maid, through the long grass a-going? For short shirt thou bearest, and no beard I see, and the last wind ere moon rise about thee is blowing. Wouldst thou meet with thy maiden, or lookest thou for me? Bright shineth the moon now, I see thy gown longer. And down by the hazels Joan meeteth her lad. But hard is thy palm, lass, and scarcely were stronger Wat's grip than thine hand kiss and make me glad. And now as the candles shine on us and over, full shapely thy feet are, but brown on the floor, as the bare-footed mowers amidst of the clover, when the gawk's note is broken and mid-June is o'er. Oh, hard are my hand-palms, because on the ridges I carried the reap-hook and smote for thy sake, and in the hot noontide I beat off the midges, as thou slepest neath the linden oar loath to awake. and brown are my feet now, because the sun burneth high upon the downside amidst of the sheep. And there in the hollow wherewith the wind turneth, thou layest in my lap while I sung thee to sleep. O friend of the earth, O come nigher and nigher, thou art sweet with the sun's kiss as meads of the May. O'er the rocks of the waste, o'er the water and fire, will I follow thee, love, till earth waneth away. The monk hearkened to him with knitted brow, and as one that liketh not the speech of his fellow, though it be not wise to question it. Then he went out of the chamber, but left the pair of beads lying in the window. But Ralph clad himself in haste, and when he was fully clad, went up to the window and took the beads in his hand. He looked into them curiously and turned them over, but left them lying there. Then he went forth also, and came into the forecourt of the house, and found there a squire of the men-at-arms, with his weapons and horse, who helped him to do on his war gear. So then, just as he was setting his foot on the stirrup, came the brother again, with his face once more grown smiling and happy. And in his left hand he held the chaplet, but did not offer it to Ralph again. Instead he nodded his head to him kindly, and said, Now, Lord, I can see by thy face that thou art set on beholding the fashion of this world, and most like it will give thee the rue. Then came a word into Ralph's mouth, and he said, Wilt thou tell me, father, whose work was the world's fashion? The monk reddened, but answered not. And Ralph spake again, Forsooth, did the craftsman of it fumble over his work? Then the monk scowled, but presently he enforced himself to speak blithely, and said, Such matters are over high for my speech or thine, Lord. But I tell thee who knoweth that there are men in this house who have tried the world and found it wanting. Ralph smiled and said, stammering, Father, did the world try them, and find them wanting perchance? Then he reddened and said, Are ye verily all such as in this house? Who then is it who hath made so fair a lordship, and so goodly a governance for so many people? Know ye not all the world's ways? Fair sir, said the monk sternly, they that work for us work for the Lord and all his servants. Yea, said Ralph, so it is. And will the Lord be content with the service of him who the devil hath cast out, because he hath found him a dastard? The monk frowned, yet smiled somewhat withal, and said, Sir, thou art young, but thy wits are over old for me. But there are they in this house who may answer thee featly, men who have read the books of the wise men, of the heathen, and the doctors of the holy church, and are even now making books for the scribes to copy. Then his voice softened, and he said, Dear Lord, we should be right fain of thee here, but since thou must needs go, go with my blessing, and double blessing shalt thou have when thou comest back again to us. Then Ralph remembered his promise to the shepherds, and took a gold crown from his pouch, and said, Father, I pray thee say a mass for the shepherd downsmen, and this is for the offering. The monk praised the gift and the bidding, and kissed Ralph, who clomb into his saddle. And the brother hospitalier brought him his wallet with good meat and drink therein for the way. Then Ralph shook his rein and rode out of the abbey gate, smiling at the lay brethren and the men-at-arms who hung about there. But he sighed for pleasure when he found himself in the street again, and looked on the shops of the chapmen and the booths of the petty craftsmen, as shoesmiths and glovers and tinsmiths and coppersmiths and horners and the like. And the folk that he met as he rode towards the southern gate seemed to him merry and in good case, and goodly to look on. And he thought it pleasant to gaze on the damsels in the street who were fair and well clad, and there were a many of them about this way now, especially as he drew nigh the gate before the streets branched off, for folk were coming in from the countryside with victual and other wares for the town and the abbey. And surely as he looked on some of the maidens, he deemed that hall song of Upmeads a good one. Chapter 7. The Maiden of Burton Abbas. So went he through the gate, and many, both of men and maids, gazed at him, for he was fair to look on, but none meddled with him. There was a goodly faubourg outside the gate, and therein were fair houses, not a few with gardens and orchards about them. And when these were passed, he rode through very excellent meadows lying along the water, which he crossed thrice, once by a goodly stone bridge, and twice by fords, for the road was straight, and the river wound about much. After a little while the road led him off the plain meads into a country of little hills and dales, the hillsides covered with vineyards and orchards, and the dales plenteous of cornfields. And now amongst these dales Hiam was hidden from him. Through this tillage and vineland he rode a good while, and thought he had never seen a goodlier land. And as he went, he came upon husbandmen and women of the country going about their business. Yet they were not too busy to gaze on him, and most greeted him, and with some he gave and took a little speech. These people also he deemed well before the world, for they were clad and buxom. And they made no great haste as they went, but looked about them as though they deemed the world worth looking at, and as if they had no fear either of a blow or a hard word for loitering. So he rode till it was noon, and he was amidst a little thorp of grey stone houses, trim enough in a valley wherein there was more of wildwood trees and less of fruit-bearers than those behind him. In the thorp was a tavern with the sign of the Nicholas, so Ralph deemed it but right to enter a house which was under the guard of his master and friend. Therefore he lighted down and went in. Therein he found a lad of 15 winters and a maiden spinning, they two alone, who hailed him and asked him his pleasure. And he bade them bring him meat and drink, and look to his horse, for that he had a mind to rest a while. So they brought him bread and flesh, and good wine of the hillside, in a little hall well arrayed as of its kind. And he sat down, and the damsel served him at table. But the lad, who had gone to see his horse, did not come back. So when he had eaten and drunk, and the damsel was still there, he looked on her, and saw that she was sad and drooping as of aspect. And whereas she was a fair maiden, Ralph, now that he was full, fell to pitying her, and asked her what was amiss. For, he said, thou art fair, and ailest not, that is clear to see. Neither dwellest thou in penury, but by seeming hast thou enough and to spare. Or art thou a servant in this house, and hath anyone misused thee? She wept at his words, for indeed he spoke softly to her. Then she said, Young lord, thou art kind, and it is thy kindness that draweth the tears from me. It were not well to weep before a young man. Therefore I pray thee pardon me. As for me, I am no servant, nor has anyone misused me. The folk round about are good and neighbourly, and this house and the croft and a vineyard hard by, all that is mine own and my brother's. That is the lad who hath gone to tend thine horse. Yea, and we live in peace here for the most part, for this thorp, which is called Burton Abbas, is a land of the Abbey of Higham, though it be of outermost of its lands, and the abbot is a good lord, and a defence against tyrants. All is well with me, if one thing were not. What is need, then, said Ralph, if perchance I might amend it? And as he looked on her, he deemed her fairer than he had done at first. But she stayed her weeping and sobbing, and said, Sir, I fear me that I have lost a dear friend. How then, said he, why fearest thou and knowest not? Doth thy friend lie sick between life and death? O sir, she said, it is the wood which is the evil and disease. What wood is that? Said he. She said, The wood perilous that lieth betwixt us and the burg of the Four Friths, and all about the burg. And, sir, if ye be minded to ride to the burg today, do it not, for through the wood must thou wend thereto, and ye are young and lovely. Therefore take my rede, and abide till the chapmen wend thither from Higham, who ride many in company. For look ye, fair lord, ye have asked of my grief, and this it is and not else, that my very earthly love and speech friend rode 5 days ago towards the burg of the Four Friths alone through the wood perilous, and he has not come back, though we looked to see him in 3 days wearing. But his horse has come back, and the reins and the saddle all bloody. And she fell a-weeping with the telling of the tale. But Ralph said, for he knew not what to say, Keep a good heart, maiden. Maybe he is safe and sound. Oft are young men fond to wander wide, even as I myself. She looked at him hard and said, If thou hast stolen thyself away from them that love thee, thou hast done amiss. Though thou art a lord, and so fair as I see thee, yet will I tell thee so much. Ralph read it and answered not, but deemed the maiden both fair and sweet. But she said, Whether thou hast done well or ill, do no worse, but abide till the chapmen come from Higham on their way to the Burg of the Four Friths. Here mayest thou lodge well and safely if thou wilt. Or if our hall be not dainty enough for thee, then go back to Higham. I warrant me the monks will give thee good guesting as long as thou wilt. Thou art kind, maiden, said Ralph, but why should I tarry for a host? And what should I fear in the wood, as evil as it may be? One man journeying with little wealth and unknown, and he no weakling, but bearing good weapons, hath not to dread of strong thieves, who ever rob where it is easiest and gainfullest. And what worse may I meet than strong thieves? But thou mayest meet worse, she said, and therewith fell a weeping again, and said amidst her tears, O weary on my life, and why should I heed thee when thou nottest heed me, neither the saints of God's house, nor the master of it, nor the father and the mother that were once so piteous kind to me? Oh, if I might but drink a draught from the well at the world's end. He turned about on her hastily at that word, for he had risen to depart, but grieved at her grief, and wishing to be away from it, since he might not amend it. But now he said eagerly, When there is that well, know ye of it in this land? At least I know the hearsay thereof, she said, but as now thou shalt know no more from me thereof, lest thou wander the wider in seeking it. I would not have thy life split. Ever as he looked on her, he thought her still fairer, and now he looked long on her, saying naught, and she on him in likewise. And the blood rose to her cheeks and her brow, but she would not turn her from his gaze. At last he said, Well then I must depart, no more learned than I came, but yet am I less hungry and thirsty than I came, and have thou thanks therefor. Therewith he took from his pouch a gold piece of Upmeads, which was good, and of the touch of the Easterlings, and held it out to her. And she put out her open hand, and he put the money in it, but thought it good to hold her hand a while, and she gainsayed him not. Then he said, Well then, I must needs depart with things left as they are. Wilt thou bid thy brother bring hither my horse, for time presses? Yea, she said, and her hand was still in his. Yet do thine utmost, yet shalt thou not get to the Burg before nightfall. O wilt thou not tarry? Nay, he said, my heart will not suffer it, lest I deem myself a dastard. Then she reddened again, but as if she were wroth, and she drew her hand away from his, and smote her palms together thrice, and cried out, Ho, Hugh, bring hither the knight's horse, and be speedy. And she went hither and thither about the hall and into the buttery and back, putting away the victuals and vessels from the board, and making as if she heeded him not. And Ralph looked on her, and deemed that each way she moved was better than the last, so shapely of fashion she was. And again he bethought him of the evensong of the high house of Upmeads, and how it befitted her. For she went barefoot after the manner of maidens who work afield, and her feet were tanned with the sun of hay-harvest, but as shapely as might be. But she was clad goodly withal in a green gown wrought with flowers. So he watched her going to and fro, and at last he said, Maiden, wilt thou come hither a little before I depart? Yea, she said, and came and stood before him, and he deemed that she was scarce so sad as she had been, and she stood with her hands joined and her eyes downcast. Then he said, Now I depart. Yet I would say this, that I am sorry of thy sorrow. And now since I shall never see thee more, small would be the harm if I were to kiss thy lips and thy face. And therewith he took her hands in his, and drew her to him, and put his arms about her, and kissed her many times. And she nothing loath by seeming, and he found her as sweet as a May blossom. Thereafter she smiled on him, yet scarce for gladness, and said, It is not at all so sure that I shall not see thee again. Yet shall I do to thee as thou hast done to me. Therewith she took his face between her hands, and kissed him well-favouredly, so that the hour seemed good to him. Then she took him by the hand, and led him out of doors to his horse, whereby the lad had been standing a good while. And when he saw his sister come out with a fair knight, He scowled on them and handed a knife which hung at his girdle, but Ralph heeded him not. As for the damsel, she put her brother aside and held the stirrup for Ralph, and when he was in the saddle she said to him, "All luck go with thee. Forsooth I deem thee safer in the wood than my words said. Verily I deem that if thou wert to meet a company of foemen, thou wouldest compel them to do thy bidding." "Farewell to thee, maiden," said Ralph, "and mayest thou find thy beloved whole and well, and that speedily. Farewell." She said no more, so he took his rein and rode his ways, but he looked over his shoulder presently and saw her standing yet barefoot on the dusty highway, shading her eyes from the afternoon sun and looking after him. And he waved his hand at her, and so went his ways between the houses of the thorp. This is the end of chapters 5 through 7 of The Well at the World's End, a tale by William Morris. Thank you for listening.